Hello again, this is Greg Lay with MentiCultura.com, and this is our fourth installment. It is a brief thumbnail sketch of the art of logic, and again, we are focusing on its daily use. This is going to be more just looking at it from a speculative point of view. Now, our mind goes through three stages or three steps when we are in the process of grasping reality, the reality around us, our world, or even the workings of our own mind is part of reality. So the three steps are: we first grasp simple notions. In the art of logic, they call that simple apprehension. That's the name of the act or stage that the mind does perform first. The second act of the mind or stage is the act of judgment, and that's where we take two of the notions that we got through our first act of the mind, the simple notions, the grasping of those, and we either connect those or we do not connect those. We see there's no connections, and so we decline to state that there is such. And then the third stage or act of the mind is reckoning. The Greek name is syllogism, which is more familiar, and that's where we reach conclusions. And that's the culmination of knowledge insofar as we come to conclude something that was not part of our awareness prior to reaching that act of conclusion. Okay, so this whole process, I'm going to read this here, this whole process is for us to escape from ignorance and to arrive at knowledge. If there are three stages or acts of our minds, then they are each essential for us to escape ignorance and arrive at knowledge. Since reaching a conclusion is the culmination of arriving at knowledge, then we must ask, what purpose do the other two stages of knowledge have? These two stages make conclusions possible. The syllogism is composed of these two stages. The reason I bring this up, and I'll state this last sentence on the bottom of the screen here, it says, by avoiding the first two stages of reckoning or syllogizing, we fail to arrive at knowledge. And the reason I bring that up is because a lot of people will give themselves the idea that logic is all about conclusions and syllogisms. You know, the old one about Socrates is a man, man is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. They think that is the essence of logic. Whereas logic is actually a culmination, or it is something where it has three components to make up the whole of it. And without the first two components, the grasping of what the natures are of the various things that we encounter in our lives, without making judgments about these things, even the simplest judgments of whether or not they actually exist or whether they do not exist, there's a false combination going on in our understanding of what these things are. All those things are necessary in order to get to a conclusion and arrive at a syllogism. So that's why I bring up this here part. Now, the examples of these three stages or acts. The first act, simple apprehension, is the grasping of simple notions. And I'll read this. As children, we grasped that mom or dad were different. We eventually, through experience, noticed that there were more people than just mom and dad. For the ones like mom, we were told they were called women, and for the ones like dad, we were told they were called men. We later noticed that men and women were alike when compared to dogs and cats. And we noticed a difference within dogs and cats where we saw mom cats and dog cats. Every simple notion we've ever had that has added to our vocabulary is part of this first act or stage of our minds. Since knowledge begins with this first step, it makes sense that the more simple notions or apprehensions we have, the more building blocks we will have in our repertoire for concluding to more and more knowledge. So it is a very simple simple approach, and it seems, because of its simplicity, very humble or lowly, but we all grasp things, the natures of these things. And so we need to, in order to break out of whatever prison of small sample of knowledge that we have in our lives presently or when we were children, It's important to add to those experiences. Not all experiences are going to be, you wouldn't want to experience death, because no longer could you form simple apprehensions or grasp simple objects with your mind if you did that. But, a lot of experiences are very essential for us to begin this process of knowledge. And so essential for us to have that first stage so that we can start making judgments. Now, the second act that we're talking about is going to be a judgment or combination, separation of subject and predicate. I don't mean to make it sound like it's a grammar exercise. It's somewhat related to it, but not completely. So I'll read this section here too. It says, not quite the same as grammar. Our minds judge two simple notions to see if they exist together or not. There is an art to this. We can judge one thing to not exist together with another, but it isn't that simple. One thing can be contrary to another, or one thing can be contradictory to another. We use this to judge if statements. We use this to judge if a statement's true or if it's false. It might not seem that important, but it is when you study the third act of the mind, or syllogism, or conclusions. When making conclusions, the components of our deduction might need some reverse operations to make them work. So in other words, sometimes when you're going through the process of thinking things through, you have to sort of flip-flop the subject and the predicate in order to conclude to something validly and therefore truthfully. Now going back to the reading here, we call judgments of these things that exist together affirmation, and we call the judgments of those things that don't exist together as negation. These are their traditional logic names. We also must see whether a simple notion we are judging applies to all the members contained within the meaning of the notion, or to only some. So here are some examples. The mere statement, he is a straightforward affirmation where our minds join he together with existence. Another one here, a unicorn does not exist, is a simple negation, again where our minds sees that unicorn and existence do not combine. And here's just some examples of contrary and contradictory. Every animal is perceptive is a contrary statement to no animal is perceptive. One of these must be true and the other false. Again, that's going to come into play when we start studying syllogisms. And then the last example, not every animal is perceptive is the contradictory statement to some animals are perceptive. The mind cannot judge both to be false because these statements are not mutually exclusive. Okay, so that's just a brief sketch of the second act of the mind, the act of judgment, the combination of the subject and the predicate, or actually the non-combination of those two. Now, for the last act of the mind, which is syllogism, or reckoning, let me just read a brief definition from Aristotle, the very inventor of logic. And this is going to be hopefully a good translation. It's mine so that I don't violate the Google copyright infringement laws and rules, but here it is. So Aristotle, who discovered the art of logic, defines a syllogism as a discourse in which once certain statements are assumed, another claim happens to follow by necessity. And so that is where our minds infer from a couple of statements or sentences, and they have all three different simple notions combined in such a way that we can conclude something brand new from these three simple notions. So that's again where, it's used, in fact, not even quite accurately, but it's used all over the place where we say Socrates is a man, man is mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. We conclude to new knowledge that Socrates is mortal. That particular conclusion isn't going to help us live our lives very happily necessarily, but there it is. That's just a small example. There's a lot to this third act. So Aristotle, the inventor of logic, has dedicated 2 different tracts to that act of the mind. There's 2 books that he wrote. One's called the Prior Analytics and one's called the Posterior Analytics. I recommend that, as difficult as they are to plow through, that you read them, but I'll be going over some of their highlights. In fact, we'll try to get into depth as we go along, time willing. So here's the last little statement, and I'll leave that meditation for you as I sign off. It says, "It might not seem like our minds go through a 3-step process to escape from ignorance. They do. Aristotle has merely traced the process. So, if we learn the process and we learn how to use the process for the betterment of our lives, we will have found a great benefit for taking our lives away from exterior influences or forces and centering our lives so that we can take them in the direction we wish for ourselves."